Welcome to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight I'm talking with Lucy Beadnell. She is the Director of Advocacy for the ARC of Northern Virginia. And today we're going to be talking about your 2020 legislative agenda. Welcome. It is a big year for many reasons, right? So regular viewers of this show are familiar with you, Lucy, because you pretty much come on every year and give us an update on programs and policy. This year, you guys have got Advocacy Day coming up on February 13th.
Yes.
And you've got bills that you are watching.
Yes.
And so what we want to hear from you today is, what are these bills you're watching in the General Assembly here in 2020?
Sure. So you're right. It is a big year for a lot of reasons, and I feel like we have more going on than we ever have in the past, which is really exciting. So on the budget side of things, our asks will be very familiar to anyone who knows the developmental disability community. The most important ask, I think, is to fund the Priority 1 waiting list. And what that means is right now we have about 13,000 people with developmental disabilities waiting on a very long list, for some of whom it seems infinite, to get core support services, to get someone to help them get up and get out of bed in the morning, to get someone who can support them on the job, to provide basic nursing care, a safe place to live. And so we've really driven people into crisis. And so when we talk about funding the Priority 1 piece of that list, that's the people most in crisis, and we've got to get them served as soon as possible.
So these are called, bizarrely enough, Medicaid waivers, which is so confusing to the public.
It's a terrible term.
Because it really is, it's not anything when people talk about Medicaid expansion and all these things, it is not related.
Unrelated. It's a relatively small, in terms of number of people served, Medicaid program. And the waiver is just a term that means, generally speaking, there are all these federal rules about Medicaid programs, but you can get some of those rules waived to give extra services to people who really need it.
Right, and these are core services. And I want to mention the fact that, the tagline of the ARC of Northern Virginia is A Life Like Yours.
Right.
So that's your upcoming benefit breakfast in March, is A Life Like Yours benefit breakfast, which, by the way, is on March the 28th, I believe.
Oh God, we'll have to double check the date.
No,
Yeah.
It's March the 28th, Thursday, March the 28th. And the reason I bring that up is because we have come to think here, as we start the third decade of the 21st century, differently about people with disabilities.
Yes.
Right?
It's tremendously exciting.
It is. And so the legislation and the public policy you're talking about really support this idea that people with disabilities want a life like everyone else's.
Yes.
And things like Medicaid waivers make that possible.
That's exactly right. We no longer want to be a separate world where housing and supports and education for people with disabilities is its own entity. We need to be a part of the discussion about affordable housing for our whole community, and education for all of our students, and safe transportation for all Northern Virginians.
And it's kind of an old-fashioned idea to think about sheltered workplace, sheltered work environments and group homes. I mean, not that there wasn't a place or isn't a place for certain kinds of group housing or certain kinds of employment, but there's so much more than that. And in integrating people with a spectrum of disabilities and abilities, by the way, because there's abilities in there, very much so, integrating them into regular workplaces, integrating them into other kinds of housing.
Treat people with disabilities like you would anybody else. And what's fascinating to me is, just earlier this week we were meeting with a group of international disability advocates. And in a lot of countries, they're far behind where the United States is. And in talking with them, we were saying, leapfrog over us. Learn from our mistakes, that to close institutions, you had to set up houses where 15 people live together. And you should pay people with disabilities 4 cents an hour for their work. We've learned that was wrong. Jump ahead and get to where we are now in 2020 and take advantage of the fact that you're just now starting to roll out community supports.
That is a great, I always think about landlines in China and how there weren't any. They went from not having a telephone to everyone had a smartphone. Same analogy here. Just forget the landline.
Much more efficient.
Just go directly to, this is what we know works.
Yes.
And, and having supports in place so that people with disabilities can be part of every community in the Commonwealth of Virginia, in this country. So talk about some of the bills that you're excited about that is going to move us a little farther down this road.
Well, I'm elated. So there's a bill coming from Delegate Corey in the Northern Virginia area that's focused on supported decision making, which I like to joke is the radical idea that everyone should be allowed to get help making a decision, right?
Yeah, right.
We talk a lot about how when people with disabilities approach age 18, they're often told by a lot of well-meaning professionals in their life, it's time for your parents to become guardians. And what that essentially means is that person with a disability never turns into an adult. They can never make their own decisions.
Legally cannot make their own decisions.
On any front, ever. Almost 90% of guardianships in Virginia are full guardianships, meaning not a single adulthood right is preserved for that person with a disability, which is problematic in and of itself, and then leads to a situation where as parents are aging, they have to come up with someone else who's going to put on this hat and be parent 2.0, and that's a big lift. So what we're working on instead is this idea of supported decision making, because everyone on the planet gets assistance from people they trust to make decisions, right? We say to our surgeon, tell that to me in people terms, right? We say, I don't know how to invest this 401k, I need a financial advisor.
Or your children tweet you or text you and say, I need, like, can you help me? Or,
It goes all the way, right?
Yeah, my kids are like texting all kinds of things. I would say that's supported decision making.
It is supported decision making, and that's it. And it's just the idea that maybe for someone with a developmental disability, we define it a little more robustly. Maybe we decide to write it down on paper so they have a clear list of who's going to help them with things. Maybe they don't. But essentially the idea that behind this bill is if someone at the school system or an attorney is pitching the idea of guardianship, we really should also be exploring the idea of supported decision making, which costs nothing, preserves rights, and grows capacity.
That sounds so logical.
Painfully so.
Okay. Well, so and I would also venture to say, because we have to be realistic about fiscal impacts and budgets, but it doesn't sound like there would be a fiscal impact or a budgetary impact for this particular piece of legislation.
Shouldn't be any impact at all to the Commonwealth, and should be a big money saver for families who pay, $3,000 to put guardianship in place.
That's excellent. So everybody needs to be watching that bill.
Yes, please. Super excited. So something else that we have coming out came right out of Fairfax County, actually. There was a long-time contract for Fairfax County government to recycle their old electronics. And that contract was held by an employer who hired a number of people with developmental disabilities to do that electronics recycling. And when that contract was put out to bid again, it was lost to a group in North Carolina who was a slightly low-cost bidder, instead of a group right here in Fairfax that was employing a grossly underemployed population. And so the bill coming from Delegate Hope essentially says public entities should be allowed to give preference in contract bidding to employers who are hiring folks with disabilities. It's a big win.
That is fantastic. Not only that, we should be putting the money back into our own local economy instead of into North Carolina.
It should be a win-win.
Yeah, okay, that totally makes sense to me too. And again, what's the fiscal impact? All on the upside. Like keeping the money here, employing people here, recycling
jobs here,
paychecks and consumer spending here, all good.
Yeah, and instead of Fairfax County paying for people to be in sheltered environments, they can say, hey, we've got great jobs that we can help you get where you're earning your own way.
I think that's great, because the idea that we are building robust jobs here in Fairfax County is really important, because it's a population, we have like 1.2 million people just in the county, not even the rest of Northern Virginia, and a certain percentage of them have disabilities, a disability that requires some type of supported work environment.
That's right.
So we need to be investing in those jobs.
Yeah, oh, high time.
Yeah.
People with disabilities developmental disabilities, around an 80% unemployment rate compared to our average in this area of well under 5%.
And they have real skills,
No question.
skills. I mean, for instance, detail-oriented or able to do repetitive tasks and find the kinds of things that might otherwise bore or wear out a neurotypical individual who wanted something different. I mean, we have to look at core skill sets and say, there are people for all these jobs. We just need to bring the people and the jobs together.
No question. And it's about that sitting down with the employer and figuring out what it is exactly they need, the core functions of that work, and the person with a disability, and matching those things together. And historically, employer speak has been very different than human services speak, and we've had trouble gelling.
Right. So this sounds like this is going to help pave a path to focusing or talking in terms of building real jobs and more jobs for people in this community.
Right here. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. What else you got?
Well, we met with a family this summer. Delegate Plum came out to talk with a family whose son is a 7-year-old, and the only thing that he's eaten his entire life is a medically prescribed formula. That's all he can have. And because he's able to ingest it by mouth, the family is spending $7,000 a year out of pocket to cover the cost of this formula. Whereas if he ingested it by a tube in his stomach, exact same product, it would be covered entirely by insurance. It's just an insurance loophole. So we're trying to marry our laws up with what we're seeing in Maryland and DC that would cover a formula like this. And it doesn't affect a ton of people, but for those it does affect, it's a big deal. And the family with whom we talked said it maybe makes more sense for us to move to Maryland, because for $7,000 we can cover the cost of a one-time move and save ourselves $7,000 a year every year. And this isn't how we should be treating families. This isn't who we are as a state.
Absolutely, and you bring up something important too about advocacy and the fact that it's not that people don't want to do the right thing, they don't know the right thing. In other words, a body, or let's say this is going through the Health and Human Services Committee. All those committee members don't know this problem exists, don't know that they need to fix a problem because they never heard of this problem before. So advocates and people who work with the ARC of Northern Virginia and other organizations, you're educating legislators as to what the problems are so they can solve them.
It's 95% of what I do. Educating. People want to do the right thing. People need to understand the best policy and the story behind it. And then the ask to vote for something is the easy part, right? You've already taught them why they would want to do it, and for the most part, people are then on board.
And I think people are often reluctant to do advocacy work if they've never done it before. You're an expert at this, and there's a reason that you have advocacy days in Richmond, is because the parents of this child sitting down in front of legislators or testifying in front of a committee makes the biggest impact of all in how these legislators vote.
It's such a different world for them to see someone sitting in front of them who does have a feeding tube, who is relying on a ventilator, who does have significant behaviors, who doesn't use words to talk, and then seeing amazing ideas and thoughts come out of this person and their family. That alone is education. And so we try really hard to have a spectrum of advocacy opportunities, everything from, there's a town hall at the rec center down from your house, and we can help you write a 1-minute question, to get on the bus with us, we'll go to Richmond, we'll meet in your legislator's office, and we'll change their mind.
You bring up something really important that I want to talk about before we go to our break, which is town halls are coming up.
Huge.
The legislative session started on January the 8th. It runs to March the 7th, and legislators are going back to their communities on the weekends and holding these town halls. Yeah. So you need to look for those all around Northern Virginia, and you need to show up, raise your hand, and ask how your legislator is voting on these particular bills.
No question.
So when we come back from the break, we're going to be talking with Lucy Beadnell.
Hi. Hoping for a crisp breeze to help keep you alert. Oh, he took a sip of water too. That'll probably help. You were probably going to turn down the radio too, so you could focus, right?
Probably okay isn't okay.
Right?
If you see a warning sign, stop and call a cab, a car, or a friend.
I think the water line is what really drove it home. I blew on him.
Caitlin, be serious. Now take the oath. Come on. I'm totally taking this seriously. Okay, I'm ready. You may begin. I pledge that I will never meet in person with anyone I first met online without checking with my parent or guardian. And furthermore, if my parent or guardian agrees to the meeting, it will be in a public place and my parent or guardian must come along. Do you pinky swear? I do.
When you teach your kids about internet safety, they'll pass it on. For more information, go to cableclicksmart.org.
Today I'm going to talk to you about physics. Come on in, girls. Let's go. This is the first rocket to get humans to Mars.
Really tall.
I'm a rocket structural engineer, designing and building parts of the rocket. You are the generation that will be stepping foot on Mars. Do I have a group of astronauts on my hands?
Yes.
You can become a rocket scientist or whatever else you want to be.
What are you looking for?
Welcome back to Your Need to Know. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we are talking with Lucy Beadnell, who is the Director of Advocacy for the ARC of Northern Virginia. I so appreciate you being here because this is a very exciting year for legislation here in Virginia.
It's a breakneck season for us, but in the best of ways.
So we know that people with intellectual disabilities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Empirical data, the data doesn't lie. What are you doing to address that particular issue?
I don't think that we could ever be doing enough in any one year to address it, but this year we're taking it on two sides. Both the prevention side, and I'll talk about that first, and kind of the clean it up on the criminal justice side. So people with developmental disabilities are not only arrested way out of proportion with our position in the population, but we're victimized way more than others. So there's a bill coming out that would look at family life education, which in my mind I still call sex ed, but now we call family life education, that says when you're offering this in a school, you need to make sure the curriculum is adapted for people with developmental disabilities, who may understand the subtleties of a relationship differently and who may have very different needs. I mean, your average teenager doesn't have someone who's going to be coming in to help them use the restroom or take a shower for the rest of their life, whereas someone with a significant developmental disability may. And what they need to know about safe contact and who to report to and what to suspect is very different. And it could help save a lot of people from trauma.
Absolutely. I mean, that is, and how many people would have thought about introducing that in the public school system? But we are more and more mainstreaming people with developmental and intellectual disabilities in our classrooms, in our high schools. And so we need to think differently about how adapted lessons really can impact the health and safety and well-being of these students.
We have to prepare people for what life is going to look like beyond school. There was data came out recently that 90% of girls with developmental disabilities will experience some kind of abuse over the course of their life. 90%, right? We're doing a huge disservice if we aren't doing everything we can to protect them.
I agree. And what else?
Yeah, so on the flip side of the criminal justice system, there's an interesting quirk in Virginia law right now. Whereas if you have a developmental disability, we can imagine more often than not, that's going to affect your processing, your understanding of whether or not something is a crime, your understanding of what you should share and how you should defend yourself in an interrogation, right? People with developmental disabilities are at a big disadvantage there. We also teach people with developmental disabilities to be agreeable, high rates of false confessions as a result. But what we've come to is that right now, your developmental disability is really only taken into account once you have been charged and tried, and we're looking at sentencing you. And the boat's really left the dock at that point. So we're looking at making sure that that developmental disability and its implications are a factor in how you're charged and your trial and determining guilt or innocence in the first place.
And also execution. So here in Virginia, there's also a legislation to abolish the death penalty here in Virginia, because again, on death row, there's an overrepresentation of people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. And the Supreme Court, I think, passed legislation at the federal level many years ago, said that you cannot execute people with a certain IQ. So I just want people to remember that too as we move forward.
And that was a Virginia case. Virginia was the state that fought to say we really should put people with developmental disabilities on death row.
Absolutely, and now we just need to abolish the whole thing altogether. But again, all of these things are interrelated. Very few silos here. You know, one piece of legislation intersects with some other piece of legislation, and all of these advocates for all of these organizations are down in Richmond trying to convince legislators or educate legislators on why this makes our communities better.
They have 60 days to look at 3,000 bills and more budget amendments than that. I don't envy them their job, but it's absolutely critical. We've got to get Virginia into a safe place to support people with developmental disabilities and their families. Otherwise, I don't think any of us are doing our job.
So there's another piece of legislation, I think, about ABA providers.
Yeah, there's a few things coming out that are going to affect schools. One is this idea that we pushed for years for applied behavioral analysis, or ABA therapy. And a lot of family members of loved ones with disabilities, especially folks on the autism spectrum, felt like this therapy was life-changing. It meant the difference between their loved one being able to learn typical tasks to respond to their name and not. And for a lot of years, we pushed to make sure that insurance was covering it, like insurance would cover any other kind of medically based therapy, right? So finally, we got to a point where insurance is largely covering this service. And then the flip side of that was about 40 hours a week of ABA are often prescribed. And I don't know many kids who have 40 free hours a week outside of school.
True.
Right? So right away we ran into this wall where finally you could get this therapy you've been waiting for years that has the potential to change your life, only you can't really get it because you're not available when it's offered. So there was a bill that passed in Louisiana recently that said, well, then allow them to take their private therapist into a school setting. ABA is effective when you're using it in all aspects of life. That benefit to the school then is you've got a trained one-on-one professional helping to support the student who may have really complicated needs, right? This was supposed to be a win-win and allow students and parents, if they chose, and assuming the person obviously abided by school rules, to come into the school setting and offer therapy in that setting too, which I think has tremendous implications for people's ability to really access a game changer.
Right. I mean, when you talk about a life like yours, we're talking about somebody working on interventional therapy in the actual circumstances under which those skills are required and needed.
Yes.
So what is the downside to that?
Right? I mean, always people worry about privacy. People worry about, well, then does this let the school off the hook from providing therapy? And I'll say, if you can show me one student in public school who's getting 40 hours a week in that school day of therapy, right? It's not happening. So I don't think we should let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
I would agree with that. You know, and I can remember too trying to get autism insurance reform, and then the fact that the specialist had to be licensed through Virginia itself, and Virginia didn't have a licensing system, and then we got a licensing system. I mean, it's just taken a decade. It's taken over 10 years to even get to this point. So people need to be watching this one too, because ultimately it helps to integrate these students into a school setting and to give them life skills that will benefit them for the rest of their lives.
And hopefully be a huge benefit to the other students and teachers. And another bill that's going to have a big impact on potentially our public and private school systems is looking at a pilot program to allow students who have been told by their home school, your needs are so complicated, we just can't serve you. That means we can tap into a special pool of funds to send you to a private school elsewhere, to instead tell those students, you've reached the point where we don't have the resources to successfully serve you. Do you want to tap into this special pool of funds and use it here? So you don't have to move away from your family. You don't have to have an outrageously long commute. Wow. And maybe so we're not spending $400,000 per student per year to go to a private school. We could really be keeping that student and family intact and growing capacity in our base school system for people who know how to handle students with real complexities.
How would that look like so I'm trying to imagine, because I know a friend of mine whose son went to a private school in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Right? And his son has since graduated and he's an adult and he's back in Virginia living in a supported housing situation in Falls Church. And so I've watched this whole arc of him and his son and how this is played out. Yeah. So what would this look like if someone had the ability to use the funds here in Virginia? How would those funds be applied, and what schools? How would it look?
So it would be totally individualized to that student. So if we found out that student needed a one-to-one aid with very particular qualifications, you would hire them. And if we found out that student needed a special adaptive equipment or more time with therapists, we would bring it in. Maybe training and supports outside of school. I've got a lot of students who refuse to go to school after some negative incidents at school, and maybe it's someone who shepherds that student from home to school and keeps them there. I mean, federal law mandates that all students with developmental disabilities are educated and are entitled to free and appropriate public education. But the net result of that has been to get that free and appropriate education, sometimes it's not public anymore. We've been pushing them toward the private sector and costing ourselves an arm and a leg as a state.
Right, because again, those funds can be used outside the state and for a residential school too, which means you're also taking a child away from their family.
As a parent of young kids, I can't imagine what it would be like to be told by my children's school system, we know we have to serve them, we don't have the capacity, how do you feel about sending your small child several states away to get the help they need? And it just breaks my heart.
Yeah, yes, it would, and I can imagine that's true for all families. So the interesting thing too about the work that you're doing here at the Arc of Northern Virginia is that it impacts people around the Commonwealth of Virginia. So this is not just Fairfax. There's 134 school districts in Virginia. There's 95 counties, and so what you're trying to do would be good public policy for people in the disability community across the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Absolutely good policy, and potentially a big budget saver. So if we look at Maybe we're spending now $400,000 a year for a student in a private residential school. Can we cut that cost in half or less than by allowing the child to stay at home with their family using some of those natural supports and bringing more robust supports into the school and home? It's a big win.
So the other thing, and you and I have talked about this before, and that is the need for more specialists, you know, and the fact that that's actually a job opportunity. So there's a lot of jobs that are going to be created in the future in technology, healthcare, and education.
Yeah.
But education, healthcare is where somebody like an ABA therapist is intersecting both of those things. And how do we get more people to choose to go into this career?
I think career is the key word there. And when we've talked with people about this big shortage we have of people who are willing to work for care attendants, for folks using those Medicaid waivers we talked out earlier, the idea is it really a career to tell someone that you'll be making $12 an hour, no overtime, no benefits, no leave, ever? And it isn't. And so I think increasing the rates that Medicaid's paying to support these providers, to make sure that folks have a real career path, is key to making sure we have people who are smart, well-trained, stay in these jobs and are doing what they're supposed to, because we're not saving ourselves any money when we have someone with complex needs who's having constant staff turnover and we're constantly having to pay to hire and retrain folks and driving that person into crisis when there are service gaps.
And I will just point out to our viewers, this is why people pushing for living wage laws and minimum wage laws at the state level for localities, or allowing localities to set a minimum living wage. This is exactly why, because we do have a dearth of people going into these low-paying jobs when they are critically important to the community that they're serving.
They're life-changing jobs. But during the holiday season, I walked past a big box store with a sign on the outside saying $15 an hour. And I thought, man, I wish we could pay people to do that. And knowing that these folks are going to have to do physically heavy lifting of people. Maybe they're going to get hit in the face by someone with behavioral complexities. They're going to have long, hard hours, and they can go here and make a lot more money with benefits. We're not giving them a fair shake.
Well, and I want people to remember that too, as we ask them to go to their town hall meetings over the next several weekends and to talk to your legislators about how you can support these bills that help people with disabilities to have a life like ours. And I would also encourage you to look at the Life Like Ours benefit breakfast on Thursday, March the 28th. It's a free breakfast. Everyone's welcome. I think Ricky Epstein would say the more the merrier. So anyone who wants to go to the breakfast, all you have to do is go to the website, sign up, and do remember that looking around our community, we need to support people who really want to live a life like ours, and that is what you need to know.